it's 1 o'clock. I think we'll just get started. Yeah, so welcome everybody to our September webinar, which is on best practices for public trails on private land. This webinar will be recorded, it's being recorded right now, and the recording will be shared with all of you afterwards, along with the presenter slides and a few other things. My name is Louise Peterson. I'm with the Outdoor Recreation Council. I'm joining today from Revelstoke, which is in the territories of the Sinixt, the Silks, the Secwepemc, and the Tonaha people. The Outdoor Recreation Council is a charitable organization with more than 60 organizational members that span the entire spectrum of outdoor recreation user groups. We work to promote and advocate for access to and the responsible use of BC's outdoors for public recreation. We build bridges between different user groups. And we represent the broad interests of the organized recreation community to government. And one of the best ways that you can support the Outdoor Recreation Council is to join us as a member or to make a donation. You can do that on our website, orcbc.ca. And actually, we just had a new member this week, Prince George ATV Club. Very happy to have them join us, and I'm hoping that they are on this webinar today. So we'll get into what we are here to do, to talk about best practices for trails on private land. So most community-based trail networks include some amount of private land near urban areas, and also significant trail interests on non-urban land or private land, such as privately managed forest lands. How access and recreation assets such as trails are managed on private land differs from crown lands. The ORC has worked with Magi with financial support from the province of BC to create a new best practice guide for developing and managing trails on private land to help trail advocates engage private landowners more effectively to gain support for trails that are valued by the community and visitors. And yeah, so today we are joined by two presenters, Magi Scallion, an outdoor recreation professional with Magi, who will present some of the key points in this new guide that we've developed. And I think it's just a week old. And afterwards, we'll hear from Stewart Spooner, who is with the Kootenay Columbia Trail Society, and he'll talk about his experiences with creating trails on private land and how best to work with private landowners. And I believe, Stewart, you're working with quite a number of private landowners. You can tell us more about that later on. And after the presentation, we'll open up for questions. So feel free to start posting any questions in the Q&A box. So yeah, so I'll just Magi, it's yours now. I'll just stop sharing here.
Thank you. I will just share my screen here. Great. So yeah, we worked over the past half a year basically to develop this guide for developing best practices for developing public trails on private land. I'm just gonna, okay. That's me. I'm Magi Scallion. Louise introduced me. I'm have more than 15 years of experience working in outdoor recreation for government and consulting in a bunch of different not-for-profit clubs across Alberta and British Columbia. I also used the insight of a number of clubs across British Columbia in the development of this guide, including Stewart and the Kootenay Columbia Trail Society, United Riders of Cumberland, the Village of Cumberland, and the Fernie Trails Alliance. And we got some advice from Capri CWM Insurance, the Private Forest Landowners Association, and the Agricultural Land Commission. So without that support, this would not be possible, as well as Ian Moore, the legal counsel for ORCBC in this project. So why private land? Well, private land's pretty interesting and important. Though it makes up a small amount of the land base in British Columbia, only about 5%, it doesn't have the published regulation and guides for development that most public land does. And further, it surrounds most of our dense population areas, so people wanting to recreate from close or near to their homes typically are going to run into private land on their way to public lands. So that's why we decided to work on this guide and develop a best practice. So let's talk about some steps to establishing the trail system. These are, I'm sure, very familiar to you all, and it's nothing new between private land and public land. But the first most important thing to do is to understand who owns the land you're looking to develop trails on and what their rights and responsibilities are. You should be considering Indigenous, cultural, spiritual, and archaeological values, and have a whole bunch of patience, because if there's one thing you can be guaranteed, it's not going to be a fast process. It never is with public lands, and private lands, you might get lucky, but often it's going to be a period of discussion and exploration. Once you have an idea of what the land base is, what the values are on the land, then you can start looking at conceptually designing your trail system. I realize that this is the best practice, and often the reality is that you have a trail on private land and you have to kind of backpedal to those first steps to get permission to have the trail there. So once you've done a concept design, you can then move toward getting permission to construct or maintain the trails. You can build the trails, and then obviously there's going to be a long-term relationship with that private landowner. So that means annual reporting and just making sure that they're happy with the relationship as well. So as I said, the first step here is to identify land ownership. And there's a number of tools that you can use, and these are publicly and readily available online. Granted, some of them are a little bit confusing. The most powerful tool is IMAP BC, and that tool allows you to access a number of different government layers of data in a GIS format, and you can import and export to IMAP BC as well. So you can import some existing trail lines, or you can export the different parcel packages in the areas that you're looking at, and figure out who owns the land there, or if it's private or public land and what sort of tenures might be at play. There is information in the published handbook on some tips and tricks on how to use IMAP BC. Also in IMAP BC is the agricultural land reserve boundaries, and the ALR also has a map finder tool as well that's linked to the data that's in IMAP BC. The second tool that I actually use a lot, I find it the most useful for my level of computer technology skills, is the BC assessment. And this, you can just type in a civic address or a civic address that maybe you don't know the exact civic address of the land, but you can kind of search for land parcels through this portal. And the great thing about BC assessment is that you get the property ID number and a whole bunch of information on the land and when it was last sold, all those types of things. I also use often the Land Title and Survey Authority of BC. So once you have a property ID number, you can actually pay a small amount of money, and the LTSA will give you the actual registered name of the owner of the property and or potentially contact information, which is definitely the next step in getting permission. And municipal, regional district governments, word of mouth are also really great ways to figure out who owns a parcel of land. So just to bounce back to the BC assessment, in British Columbia, there's 9 classifications of private land. And these are part of BC's assessments role. They impact kind of taxation on the private land, but they do have larger implications as well. So things like residential is pretty straightforward. It's like the property you own and live on. But other classes, such as farm, for example, there may be reduced taxes to be associated with the kind of farming use of the land, but there is also potentially some additional expectations on that landowner around how much of the land can be used for farming versus other purposes. Often farmland is also part of the agricultural land reserve, which requires a fair amount of management, such as closure, potentially seasonal grazing closures, buffers, fencing, and potentially restricted motorized use. The other class that's come across frequently and is quite complex is the class 7, which is managed forest land. And the Private Managed Forest Land Act places additional responsibility on landowners of this classification of land. And so beyond just the harvest of trees on this land, they are also expected to do things like fire suppression or fire management, reforestation, care of young trees, if they have sound harvesting methods, and also sometimes managed for wildlife values as well. So as easy as it is to say, oh, we should put a trail through here, we want it to go in this exact alignment, there may be concerns that you're just not aware of with regards to wildlife trees or wildlife habitat that may require your trail to be moved altogether, or for adjustments to be made to the alignment. So this kind of goes back to one of my earlier comments on having patience and understanding, and just knowing that even though someone owns a parcel of land, they might not have final say on everything that happens there because they have higher levels of responsibility and obligation. So the interesting thing about these land classifications, even though they're set or authorized by the BC assessment kind of team, they're not actually published publicly anywhere on the internet for any one parcel of land. So this is a second bit of, I guess, research and sleuthing that that you guys would have to do individually to learn about the private parcels that you're interested in developing trails on. So moving on. The Occupiers Liability Act and the Law of Negligence. This is kind of like the governing rule that kind of protects both occupiers, which can be the landowner, and it also would be you as the trail organization. So the act creates a statutory duty of care held by occupiers of a property to users of the property. So that duty of care is not to create a danger with the intent to do harm or to damage the user's property, or act with reckless disregard to the safety of the user, the integrity of the user's property. So this helps landowners allow the public use of their private land, because with this reduced duty of care that was kind of adjusted in 1998, that means that as long as the landowner doesn't do something intentionally to harm the user of a trail or their property, or act with reckless disregard, which could be like digging a hole in the middle of a trail thinking that people were done using it for the season or something like this, then they are not liable for the public use of their private land. And there's a few other little kind of I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed with the authorization and the understanding of the public use of private land. But from a trail development standpoint, this really supports trail organizations in developing or being able to request to develop trails on private land, because it gives that added layer of protection to the landowner. So what is trespassing? Trespassing is when you're not authorized to use private land. And that's pretty straightforward. It doesn't have to be posted. So just be aware that if you are managing or using a trail that you do not have authorization for, technically you are trespassing on the person's land, which can end up with fines and jail time if it was ever gone to court. So it's really good to get that permission laid out. And also, if you're promoting use of a trail that's on private land and it's technically trespassing because you don't have permission to use it, the landowner has even less of a duty of care because they're not expecting use there. So there's things that could happen that could definitely put you guys at more risk. Trespassing is bad. That's the summary. One thing I like to point out though about the Trespass Act is that if you do have permission to put a trail on private land and the landowner requests that a use type be restricted, for example, motorized use, perhaps it's a farm, and they say, yeah, we can have a hiking trail across here, but we don't want dirt bikes or quads coming through because it'll bother the livestock or whatever. Then motorized use, even if it's a designated public trail on private land, would be considered trespassing and also punishable under the Trespass Act. And that's just something nice to point out to landowners who may have concerns about different modalities of use. And I use the obvious motorized example, but it could also be mountain bikes, or it could be that they don't want hikers and make it a quad only trail. It really is up to them. So the other piece of legislation that's semi-relevant to this is the Transportation Act and the Transportation Act regulation. This is probably the grayest of all gray areas when it comes to public use of private land, but it's one that would potentially put a landowner at the most risk. Most of these other legislations and laws protect the landowner quite nicely. But this Transportation Act says that where public money is spent on a traveled road that is not a highway, the traveled road is deemed and declared to be a highway. So that would mean is if you got some funding from your local government to improve a trail and the trail crosses private land, that public money being spent on the private land could potentially make that trail designated a highway, which would then make it public land, and it would no longer be private land, which obviously is not desirable for many landowners. This has really not been tested in court, and it's just a gray area in the way the legislation is written. So there is no precedent. It's just something that's been identified as a concern that can be mitigated in such ways as signage saying this is not a highway, this is a recreational trail. Writing into your contract language with the landowner that the Transportation Act and Transportation Act regulation does not apply. Definitely something good to get legal advice about. Or simple solution is just don't use public funding to do maintenance or development of trails on private land. Use your membership funding, sponsorship, other kind of pots of money. And areas to be extra cautious if you are developing a trailhead parking lot area or providing an access road where there actually be motor vehicles traveling across private land. That's when you definitely want to use extra caution to make sure that these legislations don't exist or don't apply. So I've spoken a little bit about written agreements, and in the ORCBC written handbook document, we have a template agreement that you guys are welcome to use. We definitely recommend that you get legal advice, your own independent legal advice before entering into anything or trying things, because everyone has a different unique situation. So this template is great to use and it has lots of good language in it, but it definitely doesn't substitute you guys getting your own independent advice. Things we recommend be included in any type of written agreement would be a legal description of the land and trail, including maps. Nothing is better than a photo or a map to communicate where it is. Things like expected use and acceptable limits of use, just so the landowner is super clear on what that trail is going to look like and mean to their land. Permitted uses, insurance requirements, construction and maintenance standards, how the agreement will be terminated, reporting and record keeping, as well as non-compensation. So I mentioned non-compensation because the legal advice we've received is that generally the reduced duty of care under the Occupiers Liability Act only applies when there is no payment for use of the recreational feature. So if the dirt bike club or the mountain bike club is collecting a day use fee, that reduced standard of care does not apply. Likewise, if you, the club, is paying the landowner for use of the land to have a trail there, it's possible that the reduced standard of care will not apply to the landowner. So there might be more expectation to ensure that the trail is well maintained, signed appropriately with difficulty levels, does not contain hazards, et cetera, et cetera. So just something to be aware of. Again, a super gray area, but an easy one to completely mitigate if there's just no compensation associated. Moving on to risk management, and this kind of relates to the comment about insurance in the last slide. So when we talk about risk management, the first step of risk management is always to understand what level of risk you're willing to assume and how you can kind of work toward managing at that level of risk. So what is a liability? A liability, if you're talking in accounting terms, it's something you owe. It's money that you might owe someone. It's something that you're responsible for. So when it comes to recreational trails, your liability is the potential for someone getting hurt or having their property be damaged, and the cost to compensate that person for those losses. So that's what your liability is from a recreational trail standpoint. And insurance is money or assets that you would set aside to kind of offset that liability. So we often relate to insurance as something you buy from an insurance broker. An insurance policy could equally be money you put in a savings account every month to cover kind of the rainy day happenstance. And insurance is something that was certainly very confusing to me. So it's just easier just to pay those amounts every year and not ask too many questions. But I've learned a lot about this, especially over the past 10 years working in the snowmobile industry. And some key things that I like to share about insurance is the relationship between the broker and the underwriter. So an insurance broker is someone who's kind of like your salesperson. They're your real estate agent for insurance, and their job is to get you the deal that you want on the product you need. So think about your insurance broker as being on your team and someone that can help go through the insurance policy language and help you understand what's going on there. The insurance underwriter is typically a significantly larger company that actually holds all the money. So all that money you pay in insurance goes into one big pot, and it's sitting with the underwriter, and they're just playing the numbers games. They're people who say, oh yeah, insure this many people for this much money. We have this much in the giant pot and we can afford to pay out this many claims, and the likelihood of claims is this much. So they're kind of the mathematical geniuses that are playing the odds on the backside. And they're the ones that often also set all the like conditions in your insurance policies. So things to look out for are conditions that you might not be comfortable with when you read an insurance policy. Just recently, I was working with a snowmobile club, and they had a condition where everyone who purchased a day pass also had to sign a waiver, which when you sell 14,000 day passes in a season, that's a lot of waivers to get signed. So the snowmobile club went back to the insurance broker, who in turn went to the underwriter and requested that that clause be changed to something that says waiver delivered on a day pass is sufficient, as opposed to a signed waiver. So just things to know, that you have someone on your team and the broker, and you also have the ability to negotiate with the underwriter and ask for help and changes to your policy. Risk management, also from a basic perspective and from you guys as trail developers, involves trail design, trail standards and classification, and trail inspection and maintenance. So that means designing safe trails so you don't shoot people directly toward the face of a cliff with a turn right at the face of the cliff so they don't fly off. They're probably going to fly off if they lose control. So managing how you design a trail, where you put a trail, where you put viewpoints, how the trail alignment relates to those viewpoints is really important. Standards and classification. So if there is a trail standard that says this is what a beginner trail is, intermediate, advanced, making sure you're following those standards, because whether you are or aren't, they may be applied to you in case of a lawsuit. And inspections and maintenance. So you are responsible for what you say you're going to do. So if you say that you're going to inspect every trail in your network once a month, and you don't, then you could be found liable in case of an incident on the trails. So we generally would recommend that you use the most general standards and classification available, be within them, and also better to under promise and over deliver when it comes to inspections and trail maintenance, and make sure that you are documenting all of your trail inspections and maintenance. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the general liability insurance already so far as it comes to clauses and terms in it and your relationship with the broker. A couple other items that you really want to pay attention to when it comes to your general liability insurance policy is your limit of coverage. So typically that's 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, and that's the maximum amount you're covered for in the duration of the insurance term, which is typically a year. And your limit of coverage can also be further broken down into per occurrence or aggregate. So sometimes you have a per occurrence coverage of 1 million, but your total policy is 5 million. So that means if you have someone that sues you for $2 million and they're successful, insurance will cover you for 1 million, and your club is going to have to come up with the other 1 million somehow to pay that out. So understanding your type of use and your risks and how much you might have to pay in case of an incident or accident is really important. As well, you can have additional insureds and co-insureds on a policy and or. So we highly recommend that you have an insurance policy that covers your club, and also add the landowners whose land you're crossing as additional insureds on the policy. So that means if there's a lawsuit, and typically what will happen is your club will be named, the landowner will be named, every individual board member will be named, everyone that has anything to do with the trail will get named in the lawsuit. And so you'd like your insurance to cover the whole group. So that's where adding all these other parties as additional insureds to your insurance policy goes a long way. A co-insured is someone who not only is covered by your insurance policy, but also can adjust the terms of the policy. So you typically, unless you really trust this person or landowner or what have you, adding a co-insured is probably overdoing it and not generally recommended. Other insurances that you might want to consider would be directors and officers liability insurance, and that it's kind of like a general liability policy. Covers you against being sued, but it also covers you against decisions that maybe individual board members or club members made as well. So can solve some problems there. Property insurance, most of you probably have it. It's a good idea. That's going to cover you from theft, and damages to your property. And then participant accident insurance, specifically for events or trail maintenance days, things where you have more participation. And that is important if you're going to be doing trail maintenance days on trails on private land or hosting competitive events or fun group rides, anything like that across those private land trails. You definitely want to have some additional coverages there. Yeah, and then I think the real recipe to success, if someone says, yeah, you can have a trail across my land, is to be a good partner. And sometimes landowners would rather you not talk to them ever, and that's totally fine. But a lot of times there's a bit of hand holding that needs to be done. And so you want to be reaching out to those landowners annually, telling them how great they are, telling them about any activities that went on their land over the past year, including trail maintenance and use statistics and whatnot, and updating them on your plans for the future, whether it's trail maintenance days or events, and things like that. It also allows you to keep on top of communications that the landowner would like you to put out. Like maybe just by giving them a call and saying, how's it going? You might find out that there's been some unauthorized use on the land and you can improve the signage, or they need to have a temporary closure because of wildlife in the area and things like that. And that just goes a long way to kind of maintaining and strengthening that relationship with the landowner. So thank you for your time today. And I think we'll have some questions with Stewart first, and then mass questions at the end.
Let's do that. Yeah, I see that we've got a few questions waiting already, and yeah, if you are watching this, like, feel free to just add your questions to the Q&A box. But thank you, Maggie. Thanks for giving us this overview of everything that was in this this guide. I am going to be following up with all of you with the recording, and also I'll send you a copy of this this guidebook or this guide within the next 24 hours. So Maggie has kind of given us this kind of like high level perspective on all the things that we need to kind of think about. So we've invited Stewart, sorry, to come and tell us a little bit about what it's like to kind of work in one of those communities where you've got a lot of different landowners, private landowners. So Stewart was also one of the one of several local trail organizations that Maggie was talking to. Maggie, I believe you were talking to the United Riders of Cumberland, Stewart's organization, a few others, right?
Fernie Trails Alliance.
Right. Yeah. So there are some of those experiences are kind of captured in the toolkit. But Stu, so now that you're here, I would love to, if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about your organization, the community. And I think everybody's here would be interested in knowing a little bit about the challenges and some of the high points with respect to working with private landowners.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Louise. So, yeah, I manage the recreational trails around Roslyn and the surrounding communities. The Kootenay Columbia Trail Society has been at this since 1995. We have a legacy of our mining history. We have an unusual amount of private land around the community. So to develop the extensive network of trails that we have like 70 hiking and mountain biking trails primarily, over 200 kilometres of trail, and that's located on 37 private landowners' private property. That ranges from small private property owners, small woodlots, resorts, private forestry companies, and large sort of mining companies. And we have arrangements with all those landowners, right from handshake agreements through to a sort of a very generic land access agreement we came up with many years ago and seems to have worked well for us. And then the larger corporate landowners, they generally have legal counsel and they provide their own land access agreements. And all those have their own unique characteristics. The large corporate landowners, they have their policies, and it's more akin to sort of the reporting requirements that you might from dealing with wreck sites and trails. Small private landowners, I generally go around and have a chat with some old farmer and just see how he's doing and if he's got any problems, and agree with him when he's swearing about those disrespectful mountain bikers and whatever when you're dealing with individuals on private land, it's really just amateur psychology, working out what they need and how you're going to get along with them to maintain public access. That's generally what I deal with. But I've been doing this for about 20 years, and with all those different landowners, it's been many different challenges have come up, but none we haven't been able to solve. We haven't had any landowners cancel their land access agreement, although all of them are, they can be terminated. We don't have any open-ended agreements with the private landowners. They're all at their discretion. If they chose, they could close it. So that puts the onus on us to be, really cooperative. And that's what we try and do. I think the counterintuitive thing for some people is that, you've got to realize that these private landowners are your primary stakeholders, that your job is not to actually represent the users in those agreements. You really have to look out for the interests of the landowners. And that means, when you've got rogue trail builders or disrespectful trail users or whatever the problem is, your goal has to be to see it through the landowner's point of view and solve the problem for them, not, look after your buddies who happen to be building the illegal trail, or, you've got to be on, they want you to be on their side. And that's what enables these long-term stable relationships. Anyway, that's I can, as I say, I've been doing it a long time. Happy to get into any detail and any aspect of it, but that's what I do.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So like, just in terms of kind of dealing with people who are maybe not doing exactly kind of what they should be doing out on the land, how do you like, do you educate like your members, and do you also like look out for issues? And
yeah, I mean, we have issues of every type and scale. For example, a landowner wants to cut down some trees in their property. The community's expectation might be that land resembles a beautiful forest park in perpetuity. And when the landowner wants to cut down the trees, you have all the usual sentiments being expressed on social media, people being outraged and ranting and raving and not respecting signs and going through active logging sites. And, ultimately, we don't have, we can't make people behave, but we can certainly show the landowner that we're on their side. And, in that instance, we would enter into public discussions and try and make sure that all the reasonable people understood that the trails only exist at the, due to the generosity of the private landowner, and, behaving like, it's a public park isn't appropriate. And just generally taking the perspective of the landowner in that situation. Closing the trail as necessary, putting up signs.
Well, that's good advice. Maybe before we sort of head over to the questions, any sort of any other kind of key pieces of advice, to trail groups that are kind of getting into that are just about to start building these relationships with private landowners? And
yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, just that they are relationships. That it can be quite challenging getting started, because you don't necessarily have a personal relationship with the individual that matters, but we all live in fairly well-connected networks. If you don't know them individually, maybe you know someone that knows them. It's finding that opportunity to have a reasonable discussion, and just letting it take a little bit of time. No landowner is compelled to allow public access to their property. They have to feel like that you're a responsible partner, and then you need to make those arguments that make them realize that it's actually to their benefit, that there are it's not just a generous move for the public good, that particularly for these people that own forested lands where there already are trails, that entering into an agreement with a responsible partner can actually be to their advantage. We can keep people on just the trails that they have permission for, that we can maintain that in good condition. I think I saw one of the questions. I'll get ahead of things here, but it's not a landowner that thinks they're being protected by the Occupiers Liability Act isn't seeing the full picture, because that doesn't mean they can't get sued. Somebody hurts themselves in their property, you can go to court and maybe win in the end, but that's a pretty painful thing for an individual to take on if that's what you're relying on. And by entering into a partnership with an organization that has liability insurance, that means that the insurer is going to pay for the lawyer to go to court and argue the intricacies of the Occupiers Liability Act, and that the landowner presumably won't even enter the picture. They may be named on a lawsuit, but they can sit back and trust that there is a fund backing them, and some competent professionals that are going to go in there and make the best arguments and make sure that they're not found liable, rather than just trying to deal with it by themselves.
Great. Well, we've got another 15 minutes. So I haven't looked at all the questions yet, but just letting you know that none of us are lawyers. I guess Maggie does have quite a bit of experience in kind of creating this toolkit, but the ORC does have an analysis of some of the piece of legislation that deals with the development of trails on private land. So if there's something that we can't answer, we can definitely refer you to good lawyers, but also we do have this legal piece that we can share with you, but you have to just let me know, send a note to me and I'll send it to you. Maggie, are you interested in responding to this first one?
Yeah, I think Stu did a great lead in to this. My answer to this is very timely. So right now, question number one is with respect to the Occupiers Liability Act. There's a landowner who thinks that if they don't acknowledge that there's a trail on the land, they're more protected than they would be if they acknowledged the trail was on the land. And that, I would say, is an incorrect assumption on the part of the landowner. Because they are aware that the trail is on their land and they are permitting use of that trail, then it's effectively, they have that lower duty of care under the Occupiers Liability Act, but a user may still sue them. And as Stewart was saying, they could get sued, and it would be so much nicer for them to be covered by the club's insurance as opposed to their own private insurance and having to go through that whole process as it is. How I would kind of speak to this landowner is simply explain to them that by permitting the use, they're kind of accepting the use, and they would be better off to enter agreement, formally delegate the maintenance and care of that trail to the not-for-profit club, require that the club provide them with insurance coverages as an additional insured, and that will in the end decrease their level of responsibility.
Oh, we got another question from Justin here. A grant such as those from the Columbia Basin Trust consider public funds, classifying the funded trail as a highway. Maggie, you live in the CBT area.
That's a great question. And one that like personally, I'd off the top say no, they wouldn't be considered public funds. It's not directly from the government, but it is a non-governmental organization. The easiest way to mitigate that risk is simply to write into your agreement with the private landowner that the Transportation Act does not apply, full stop. And then you can use whatever money you want. Not worry about it.
There are definitely some mitigation strategies that you can use.
Mhm.
But yeah, like as Maggie said before, like the law is pretty gray yet still in regards to how the Transportation Act applies. We got somebody here asking, is the GIS survey land tool or IMAP BC? Oh, it shows that a Forest Service road is included as part of the private land parcel and the property owners block the road to public land. On the other side, how do we determine if we can access the public land on the other side? This is a growing issue in the East Kootenay area.
I will just refer you to another handbook that the ORC recently released about accessing public land and what is public land. I am definitely specialized on the developing trails aspect. So yeah, I mean, it's not fair, but I don't have the backup to say yes or no.
So I can definitely make sure that I send, I send that publication as well. So it's about like how to kind of prove that you have a right to access land. So that might be, might complement what like this other toolkit that Maggie and McLean have created. We've got another one, another question. Can anyone pay the fee and access land title and survey property ownership information? Can anybody do that, Maggie? Your experience?
Yes. If I can do it, I'm sure anyone else can.
Good. We got one here from Stefan. Stefan joined a little late. Any comments or advice on director's insurance for clubs dealing with wreck sites and trails or private land? And I can just say that in one of my kind of closing remarks, I was just going to tell you about another webinar that's coming up, and that's actually about liability coverage for recreation groups. So if Maggie or Stewart can't answer this question, come along to the next webinar that the OSC is hosting. I can tell a little bit more about that in a moment. But Maggie or Stewart, do you have any?
I will just say that the trails insurance is amazing, and it's so amazing that the government provides that to not-for-profit clubs, but it does not absolve your need for insurance. It sounds great, but that insurance doesn't cover you for any events that you might host off of Wreck Sites and Trails BC kind of tenure property. So if you have your board meetings at a local restaurant and someone slips and falls there, you're not covered. I don't believe it covers you for events. And it definitely would not cover any trails that are on private land. So if you ever do anything that's not on a Wreck Sites and Trails land, you definitely want to have a separate insurance policy.
And you also doesn't cover you for any HR issues, hiring, firing, harassment, within a board, with employees. Yeah, anything beyond. I mean, yes, Wreck Sites and Trails is going to cover you for somebody hurting themselves on a trail on public land. For everything else, no. And you should be aware of the scope of what your liabilities are. And for most organisations, that means duplicating Wreck Sites and Trails insurance with a separate private general liability policy and directors and officers policy.
Good. Okay. So one idea we had for small connecting trails was to ask the municipality to extend some form of insurance to the private landowner. Would this put the private landowner at risk because it could be interpreted that their land is now public? And if so, how could this be mitigated?
That is a great question. And I would just recommend legal advice from a lawyer would be your best move in that sense. But based on my knowledge, I think that it would be hard to extend some sort of Transportation Act like assumption across. Always good to ask.
Yeah, it's not gonna affect the status of the land. Public funding for insurance, whether that's directly from a municipality or through a non-profit. That's the way it works with most non-profits working in this space, and it certainly doesn't change the status of the land.
We've got somebody asking, how can we get a copy of the agreement template that Maggie mentioned? And I can say that you will receive that by email if you've registered within the next 24 hours. So it's like an appendix to the toolkit that McElhaney has created. So yeah, you will have that. Let's see, let's scroll down here. Maggie, that's the question from Wayne. Maggie, and Wayne's our chair, the chair of our board. Maggie, which are the best layers, sorry to use an IMAP, best layers?
Great question. I have not memorized it off the top of my head, but I definitely put it in the handbook. The key layers that have the private land, parcels, and the crown tenures.
Another question is, can you repeat the name of the government rec sites and trails insurance? How does one sign up for that? So Stu, you can probably talk to this, but I mean, if you are a partnership holder with Recreation Sites and Trails BC, you will be offered this insurance, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, you have to enter into a partnership agreement with Rec Sites and Trails for some trail or rec site or facility. If you don't have that relationship, then you don't get the insurance. And if you do enter into those agreements, then it comes along with part of the deal.
Yeah. Got a question here from Terry, and I think this might be the last question. Like, make sure that you let us know if you got any more questions. This is from Terry regarding general liability insurance. Does coverage typically just cover members or both members and the general public? Can you insure the general public?
So what general liability insurance covers you against broadly is getting sued, whether it's by members or by the general public. So it's not like a property insurance policy where you like smash your car and your car gets fixed. Like if you hurt yourself when you're out snowmobiling as a member of a club, in order to get compensated for that, you need to sue the club and prove that they were negligent. And so what the general liability insurance does is, on the club side, it protects them against getting sued. And it covers all members of the club, including the directors and employees, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So thanks, Maggie. So Terry and others, yeah, definitely come along to the next webinar. So it's on October 11th at 1 o'clock. We've got Capri CMW, one of the big underwriters. Is that right, Maggie? Like, they're actually not like an insurer.
They're a broker.
Oh, they're a broker. So they're a broker. But they do know a lot about liability insurance. They will talk about, the different types of liability insurance coverage that you should consider. And yeah, you can bring your questions then. So yeah, like, I don't see any more questions. So I think we could just sort of like wrap up. Anything else from you, Maggie, Stewart, that we didn't touch on? Yeah. Well, then I will just say thank you so much, Maggie and Stewart, for joining us today and presenting. And to everybody else who joins. So we do these webinars once a month, and they're on all kinds of topics. So I will send you all an email tomorrow, and feel free to respond with something that you really want to know about. So I think that's probably it. So as I said, yeah, you will get this best practice guide along with the registration link to our next webinar. So with that, thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.